and welcome back to Scottish Independence Podcast. For today's podcast, we are back through in Edinburgh again for our second Hustings event. This one hosted by Scottish CND, with questions posed from representatives from quite a wide range of organisations in the general sphere of peace, economy, the environment, sustainability. There were 4 parties represented. 3 who were invited but didn't turn up were the Scottish Tories, the Scottish Lib Dems and Reform UK, and you can draw your own conclusions about what their responses might have been by the fact that they didn't turn up. Lynn Jamieson from Scottish CND is chairing the event, and let's go over to the Quaker Rooms as she welcomes the panel.
People will be asking questions from the floor. Each of you will get 2 minutes to answer. So we have Ross Greer, the co-leader of the Greens. Great. We have Colin Fox from the Scottish Socialists.
How are you?
We have Alex Kerr from the Scottish National Party. And we have Sarah Boyack from Scottish Labour. So thank you very much today. And I'll now call on our first question, which is from Samuel Raphael Williams from Scottish CND.
Hi everyone, and yes, I'd like to reiterate my thanks to the representatives who are here this evening. My question is as follows on behalf of Scottish Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Does your party support the aims of the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, now signed by over half of the world's nations, which comprehensively bans these weapons? Thank you very much.
Ross.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you to CND and the whole coalition for hosting. Starting off with a very easy question. Yes, absolutely, the Greens support the Treaty on the Prohibition on Nuclear Weapons. As you would expect, the movement for nuclear disarmament is one of the movements that came together to form the Green movement, the global capital G political Green movement across the world. So it's core to our identity as a party and as a political movement to campaign for nuclear disarmament at every opportunity and at every level. I think it's very easy in the context of a devolved election campaign for those who don't really want to talk about these issues to say that's reserved, leave that for general elections. But we know, and I'm sure we'll explore tonight, that there are many ways in which the Scottish Government and Parliament and local government in Scotland can play a really powerful role in the campaign for nuclear disarmament globally. During the period where the Greens were in government, ourselves and the SNP produced papers on what an independent Scotland would look like under the shared elements of our vision. And as part of that process, we were able to confirm through an exchange that I had with Angus Robertson in the Chamber in Parliament that at that point, what we referred to as our Butte House Agreement government, we collectively committed that an independent Scotland would be a signatory to the treaty and do everything we can to implement it. The final point I would make on that, though, is for the Greens, the only way to be consistently and truly anti-nuclear is to be anti-NATO. There's no point in saying, well, we wouldn't have our own nuclear weapons, but we'll adopt a don't ask, don't tell policy about our NATO allies using our bases, using our territorial waters to sail their submarines and to operate their own arsenal, etc. So the only way to be consistently anti-nuclear is to be anti-NATO.
Colin.
Well, thank you very much for your question, Samuel. Can I say, I feel as if I'm sitting my higher physics, so I hope you'll bear with me because I sat it 3 times and failed it. Anyway, I wanted to thank you for your question. Thank you all for coming. The answer to your question is yes. I'm tempted to leave it there and use my other 2 minutes somewhere else. But the Scottish Socialist Party's supported the campaign for nuclear disarmament since the inception of the party 30 years ago. And I have to say to you, it's more important now than it's ever been. Sorry to say, my kids, unlike myself, are grown up in a world where warmongering seems to be the norm. No shortage of money for guns and killing people. It's a retrograde step. It's to be very much regretted. And like Ross said, the Scottish Socialist Party also is anti-NATO. For us, NATO should have been wound up after the Soviet Union collapsed. It's a warmongering machine, and it should have used the opportunity to wind up the Cold War on both sides. Unfortunately, it's not done that. And I take my hat off to CND and its supporters worldwide for continuing to bring pressure on our moral, legitimate and legal right to rid the world of nuclear weapons.
Thank you. Yes, we're in favour of the treaty and abolition of nuclear weapons. The SNP's long been committed to abolition of nuclear weapons. They're an absolute disgrace and a moral outrage. Nobody should have the power to kill that many people. You know, we've long campaigned as a party in favour of this. Our outgoing MSP Bill Kidd, I think, was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. I think CND might have been involved in that as well. So we have a long track record in this, and that's not something that's going to change for us. As has been touched on, you know, the world we're living in is increasingly dangerous at the moment, and everything, it's a job as politicians and political parties to do everything we can to de-escalate that and try and bring peace through dialogue. You know, that we can see what's happening abroad, and that's something the SNP will always use our platform for, is to speak against sort of war crimes, to speak against genocide, and to seek to use our position for peaceful dialogue and resolution of conflicts across the world.
Thank you. Sarah.
I'm Sarah Boyack from Scottish Labour. I am not a candidate. So can I put in apologies for our candidates, most of whom are at Hustings tonight, and that's why they weren't able to be here. So I am the person that's coming to speak to you all, and given all the applause, I'm probably going to be in a tricky position. But for me, the UK signed the non-proliferation of nuclear weapons commitment when Labour was in power. We are the only members of the UN Security Council to have actually reduced our nuclear capacity to a single weapons system. The other members of the UN Security Council, US, France, China, Russia, we're still at that place. So the comments that were just made by Alex about dialogue, peace through dialogue, could not be more important now, because you've got what's happening in Ukraine, which is, I mean, if you told us 4 years ago that it would still be happening, that is scary. And NATO we need to be part of, but it's about not just NATO and defence, it's about the rest of the world as well, because you've got conflicts in Sudan, you've got the Middle East, you've got Iran that I don't think most of us saw coming with what the US and Israel have done over the last couple of weeks. Then you've also got the challenge in Gaza and the West Bank. So the world is, I think, the most dangerous time we've ever had. So there is an issue about how we promote peace and how we promote the security of our country. And you know, at the moment, what we have got to do, I think, is be constructive as a country. Now, as was commented at the start, this is not on the Scottish Parliament elections, but for us, it's not just about Scotland, it's the UK, it's our other European countries and allies, and those on the border of Russia who are incredibly nervous at the moment. And democracy has to be absolutely central to this, as well as peace. So the fact that you're not going to agree with everything I say tonight, we're a democracy, so at least let's have this debate. And what I commit to doing is taking back the feedback I get in the room to have discussions with colleagues, both the Scottish Party candidates and also my UK colleagues.
Great, that's
Thank you.
Thank you. Great, so the next question I think is going to be asked by Pete Roach. And you can say where you're from. Thank you.
I'm here representing Scram, the Scottish Campaign to Resist the Atomic Menace, which has been revived for various reasons, as you probably guessed. So my question is, would your party maintain the Scottish Government's current ban on new nuclear power stations in Scotland?
Colin.
It's always more difficult being the first question to answer, isn't it? I passed Torness Power Station the other day on my way to Sheffield to visit the family, and I was struck by, you know, how time has just flown. I remember protesting about Torness Nuclear Power Station getting built, what was that, 25, 30 years ago, and now they're talking about it being decommissioned. Listen, to answer your question directly, I think that the issue of energy supply, Scotland's future energy supply, rests on renewable energy. As a former politician who might remain nameless, or one of my colleagues might mention, and we talked about the potential for Scotland to be the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy. That potential is huge, therefore we don't need nuclear power stations. And can I say this, Lynn? I went when I was an MSP between 2003 and 2007 to visit Torness Power Station. I visited it and they met me, they were very kind. They gave me cups of tea. They were interested in knowing why the Scottish Socialist Party opposed nuclear power. And they agreed to show me around. And I said, see, before you go and show me around, is it okay if I go to the toilet? Because I've had about 9 cups of tea. And honestly, God, the whole the executive of, I think it was EDF then, took me to the toilet. And I remember thinking, do you think I've come here to blow the place up? Anyway, they took me around, and one of the things that I did say that fascinated me is the way it works. And they said, do you see that green turbine over there? And I'm not sure, it's about the size of a car. And they were saying that provides a quarter of Scotland's electricity at this moment. And they left me to stand on this plate. They all went up for some excuse to look out the window of the gantry. They came back down and retrieved me and said, you know, you were standing right on top of the nuclear rods. And my final question in answer to this is, when I asked them, I explained that I was against nuclear power. And one of the reasons was, I asked them, what happens to the waste material? And they explained that a double-deck bus sized of material goes once a quarter to Sellafield and has done from 25 nuclear power stations. That's what's wrong with it. Thank you, Lynn.
Okay, so if I'm not projecting properly, do stop me, because I have a habit of sometimes doing that. Very, very short answer is yes, absolutely. We brought that position in. That's a position we will maintain using the planning system. I'm going to use the rest of my time to make a sort of wider point here, which is that in the previous question, the respect for democracy was brought in, and I think that's vitally important that we respect democracy and that people have the right to choose their own future. I think, given there's an unresolved question here about Scotland's question as to the UK blocking that, particularly when you have UK governments hanging over the Scottish government, who are, you see what happened today with the sort of withdrawal of the wind turbine factory that would have brought Scottish jobs and energy and helped produce that renewable base that we need. And they're currently pushing to have nuclear power plants sited in Scotland. We'll do our best. The Scottish government's been overridden before, and the party to my left don't want you to have a say on your future. They don't want 50% of the country to have a say on their future. Think about that for a minute.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sarah.
Well, there's a bit of an irony here, given that last answer. When polling was done last year, it said that around 52% of people who voted SNP in 2021 supported using nuclear power to reach net zero, and 56% of Scots generally support using nuclear. So it's a balanced issue. For me, the priority at the moment has to be renewables, and I set the first target of 20% when I was a minister, like 27 years ago. That was seen as bold and radical. We now make 100% of our renewables electricity when it's windy, but when it's not, we import nuclear from down south. And at the moment, Torness is actually shut for safety reasons. It has to get monitored. It's like getting your car checked. They have to do that every year, and we're currently importing nuclear from Hartlepool. So we've gone from 20% being an ambitious target to now we've got renewables across the country. I still think you need nuclear in there, but not everywhere. My priority would be Torness. It would be an SMR at Torness. That's technology, unlike some of the very big power plants that are being built that are taking years, they're over budget down in England. So I would use that tech, which most European countries are now using. But the focus has to be electrifying our economy, our homes, our buildings, moving to low carbon tech, because we have a climate emergency. So renewables has to be most of the production of energy, but I still think you need nuclear in the mix. And as what happened at Grangemouth, if you don't act now, you will lose hundreds of jobs in Torness, the economy will be hit, and we'll miss out on the opportunities. So I would go for, that would be my priority. But it's got to be linked up with renewables, and it's also got to be used where you use your electricity. We need more local supply, more community ownership of renewables, so that people actually get the direct benefits. And if I was going to build new infrastructure, I'd do Investis in Leith. And we're missing out. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Right, now, I'm sorry, I should have allowed, but I did say to people who were asking questions, if they wanted to make a short contribution in reply, they could. So, Pete, do you wish to do that?
Ross.
Oh, Ross! Ross! Right, I'm so good, you're keeping everything right. I've got an audience that's keeping me right.
I don't think I'm going to say anything that will surprise anyone. So, of course, the Green Party opposes new nuclear, absolutely, unequivocally, including the nonsense of small modular reactors. It should be a categorical no to new nuclear in Scotland. Alex makes a really important point, though, that is the consistent position in Scotland, but we have a UK Labour Party that is pushing nuclear really hard, and ultimately any decision the Scottish Government and Parliament makes can be overturned by UK Government and Parliament. So there is a real risk of nuclear power being brought in against the democratic wishes of Scotland's Parliament on this. It's not only expensive, not only would it take far too long to construct even the small modular reactors if we're talking about a decarbonisation agenda. But one other thing I want to bring in is the implications from the mining for uranium extraction in the first place. So Alex mentioned Bill Kidd quite rightly. So Bill, fabulous MSP, he'll be a huge loss to the Parliament. Really dedicated anti-nuclear and peace campaigner. Bill's chaired the Parliament's cross-party group on nuclear disarmament for the last 5 years, and I was his vice chair. And Bill and I, during COP26, hosted some people here from Native American tribes whose communities have been absolutely devastated by the impacts of uranium mining. So it's not just that it's expensive, it's not just that it would take too long, it's not just that it is not a solution to the climate crisis, but there's profound damage that is done. And that's way before you get to the question of the waste and the fact that there is this absolutely toxic legacy. But Sarah also mentioned community ownership. I really strongly believe that our energy system should be decentralised, it should be taken out of the hands of multinational corporations. Communities can't own their own nuclear power stations. Communities can own their own wind turbines. You can put solar panels on the roof of a primary school or a town hall or whatever it is, but communities cannot own nuclear infrastructure. So if we want to decarbonise, but if we also want to decentralise power over our power systems, power over our energy network, and put it in the hands of people rather than corporations, all investment needs to be going into renewables, and every penny that's put into nonsense white elephants like small nuclear reactors is money that is not going into the real solution, which is community-owned renewables.
Okay, great, thank you. You want a very short response?
I would just point out that the two reactors at Torness started off at 660 megawatts each. They're less now because they're a bit old, so they have to be down-rated. The reactors that the government calls small modular reactors produced by Rolls-Royce are 470 megawatts. So they're not small at all, they're almost the same size as the Torness reactors.
Okay, thank you very much. Go to the next question, which is going to be asked by...
I'm a member of the Edinburgh Climate Coalition, which was formed when we had COP26 in Glasgow. It's a kind of the awkward political squad of the climate justice movement in Edinburgh. The question is to you, friends, do you and your party support the running of a public information campaign about the climate and nature crises to include showing the People's Emergency Briefing, which is this short 45-minute film, across all terrestrial channels? So a proper public information campaign. Thank you.
Okay, right, so it's you, Alex, to start, please.
So I couldn't see, without having seen the 45-minute video, whether that's something, we'd be able to do. What I would say is the Scottish Government does have quite a few campaigns we run in terms of public awareness, in terms of Keep Scotland Beautiful, and why we need to take climate change seriously, and why renewables is the answer to that, and takes you a transition away from oil and gas to renewables. There's a lot of stuff, the discussion with nuclear around having to import nuclear there's a thing about the base load of power, which is kind of what the excuse a lot of people use as to why you need nuclear, but that's something you can achieve with tidal power too. So long story short, I couldn't commit to that specific thing, but I can commit, I think, to the Scottish Government using the platform again and the kind of pulpit that it's got to promote the need for climate change, the need for green investment, a lot of which we've done through the Scottish National Investment Bank, like you've got kind of NIG and things like that as well. And again, I think independence is a key to unlocking quite a lot of this investment too. And actually independence in the European Union, I think, is a way to probably bring down the cost of that investment as well. So I'll leave it at that because I'm probably running towards 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Sarah?
I haven't seen the video you're referencing, David, so I'm going to have to do my research after tonight's meeting. What I would say is that in the last few months, we have been scrutinising the Scottish Government's climate change plan in Parliament, and on Tuesday it was finally published. And loads of organisations like Stop Climate Chaos were involved in lobbying for a much stronger plan, and that was my position as well, because we failed 9 out of the last 13 annual climate targets, and that isn't good enough. We've got to do much better in Scotland. Regard it as an opportunity. It is a shame we don't have the Tories here today, because they've moved from being actually recognising we've got a climate emergency to actually going into denial. And we've got to work with our constituents right across the country. So I would say the thing we pushed for in the Net Zero Committee was a monitoring process, a dashboard, because we're now doing 5-year carbon budgets, not annual targets. So there's a real danger that in the next Parliament, 5 years' time, we'll be looking at what's happened after 5 years. We need action now, and I think that's the absolutely critical thing. So if you've got big renewables, yeah, we should be building them in Vestas at Leith, but it took so long to get the project through planning in Scotland. So I think we need to do more. Wave Energy Scotland, totally agree. More of that is required. And I was campaigning, and they've now got an extension for a year. They were going to just disappear. But because we campaigned in the Parliament, the Scottish Government are now agreeing with funding for an extra year. There is so much more we can do. Edinburgh, solar co-op. Our schools and our leisure centres have got solar panels. We should do that in every city and every town in Scotland. You have to have new renewables when you're building homes, because I amended the 2009 Climate Act constructively. But what about our existing houses? Everything needs to be fixed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you to David for the question. Sarah mentioned the Scottish Government's climate change plan. I think it is worth touching on that now, because she said we only had the opportunity on the second last day of this 5-year Parliament to actually have the Scottish Government answering questions on that in the Parliament. And in short, it is a shockingly poor plan. Really, really disappointingly weak. And if you compare to just a few years ago, the Scottish Government has so obviously scaled back its ambitions to tackle the climate crisis, which I think is a real travesty, not just in terms of our moral obligation to secure a future for life on this planet, but also in terms of the economic opportunities there were for Scotland in the just transition, and the fact that we're scaling back on that. A couple of years ago, when the Greens and the SNP were in government together, we had a Scottish Government that was opposed to new oil and gas fields in the North Sea. It was opposed to Rosebank. It had a presumption against any new North Sea oil and gas. That was in the government's draft energy strategy. Now we have a Scottish Government that has dropped that position and that won't publish a final energy strategy and has published a really weak climate plan. But on the specifics of the question, the national emergency briefing, if I remember correctly, it was my English Green MP colleagues who made sure that briefing was hosted in Westminster. I certainly think the BBC should be broadcasting the public information documentary. Technically a little bit trickier to get the other broadcasters to do it, but certainly the BBC as the national public service broadcaster, they should certainly be doing it. And the final thing I just wanted to say on that in terms of public information is, one thing, I'm the Greens education spokesperson, one thing I'm really proud that we did when we were in government was mainstream climate justice education across the whole curriculum. So Scotland now has what's called the Learning for Sustainability Action Plan, which means that education about the climate emergency and how we tackle it isn't siloed away as a wee topic that may or may not be covered. It now has to be mainstreamed across the entire curriculum, the entire school experience. So we've got schools who are really really starting to embrace that now. And I'm not taking credit for it as the Greens. We delivered what was asked of us by the Teach the Future campaign, which is a youth climate justice campaign. So I want to give them credit for that, because it means that Scotland is a world leader in climate education in our schools now.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just say, also thanks for your question, David. I have to say, I've never heard of the National Emergency Briefing, and I suspect that says more about me than anybody else. But the general point that you're making seems to me to resonate really importantly in the need for a properly funded information campaign to the public about climate change, the global emergency, and what's in front of us. I say that because I've been aware, I'm sure you have too, the last couple of years, the public have been inundated by the propaganda of Donald Trump, reform, and the climate change deniers. There's no question about it. It's sneaked right into mainstream media wherever you go. And that's probably another question that somebody will raise about who actually controls the media in the world today. I've seen that documentary recently that Netflix put about Rupert Murdoch. It was garbage, but it drew your attention to the fact this is a billionaire in charge of much of our media. And that's the same in virtually every country in the world. It's a shocking circumstance because it's a threat to our democracy. Democracy relies on information, scientific information, reasoned discussion, and we're being denied it. We're being denied access to that. And I think it's really, really important at this debate on climate change, global warming. I have to say that I think some of the younger generation are far more in tune with what's actually happening than people who'd like to dismiss it as crank territory, maybe influenced by reform and Trump, etc. And the debate, such as you mentioned, a proper public debate, properly funded, properly provided with information for people to make up their own mind, really, really important, instead of the point scoring that is often, as far as they go on TV, as far as they go in politics programmes, as far as they go in Parliament. There has to be a broader, more informed, scientifically based result of that debate, and it couldn't be more important.
Okay, great, thank you.
So I'll follow up just by apologising for talking about something that only today that the short teaser has been released. It's going to be called The People's Emergency Briefing. I don't think it's the right title, but never mind. There were 8 eminent professors at the top of their game talking about tipping points, about food insecurity, about what's coming down the tracks. And I encourage everybody here also to look out for the films. There are going to be about 1,500 community run film shows over this summer. And so I hope that there might be a briefing for the new MSPs coming into Parliament.
Thank you. Great.
This is a question on behalf of Friends of the Earth Scotland, and is continuing a theme of the previous 2 questions. To address in the panel, would you and your party support the aim of producing all of Scotland's energy, including for electricity, heat and transport, from renewable sources by 2045?
Okay, Sarah.
Yeah, so I'll probably be the outlier in this one again. The vast majority should come from renewables, solar, wind, on and offshore, wave, huge opportunities, but we also think there should be a modest amount of nuclear because we're currently having to import it. What I think we really need to do is to think about where we produce our power and how we use it. I was reading an article this week about data centres in Edinburgh, and it is huge the amount of electricity data centres require. And thinking about electric vehicles, yep, great, but we also need public transport to give people alternatives to cars. So things like better buses that are low carbon, trains, electrifying trains, but we don't have trains everywhere for people. So there's a huge amount we need to do now to actually electrify our economy and everything we do in the country, and then make sure we've got the electricity to supply it. And I go back to my point, if you look at some of the other European countries, a lot of their big investments, like Vestas or EDF, these are publicly owned companies, and I think the opportunity in the Scottish Parliament elections would be to have more community owned electricity. I'd also like to see more local authorities having heat networks, solar farms. There's so much more that we could do now in Scotland, and it's really good that this week NESO has actually started talking about regional planning, not just produce electricity and send it somewhere. Think about where you're going to use it. And I think for Scotland, that would actually get people much more engaged about the benefits of renewables and how we can have them developed in our country.
Thank you. Ross.
Thank you, and thanks, Guy, for the question. Yes, absolutely, 2045 is what we should be aiming for. We should be under no illusions about how difficult that is now going to be because so many opportunities have been wasted over the last couple of years. The really big challenge that we've got in Scotland is in how we heat our buildings. We've been, as Sarah mentioned, we've been really successful at generating enough electricity from renewables that it now actually exceeds our current total electricity demand. But if we want to decarbonise, that means we're going to have to replace our gas heating network for buildings with one that is based on electricity as well. So that will massively increase electricity demand. My predecessor as co-leader of the Greens, Patrick Harvey, was the minister for this heating buildings agenda a couple of years ago, and he prepared a bill to go through the Parliament to actually move this process on. And then everybody is aware, obviously we left the government before we had planned to leave, and our successors in those areas of government dropped that bill. And in fact, that was one of the questions that was asked of the government about their climate change plan on Tuesday of this week. How are you possibly going to hit these targets if you have no agenda for how we decarbonise heating buildings in Scotland? And we got a kind of vague answer on that. The reality is we should be doubling down everything we can possibly do to help households switch over to heat pumps, whether it's air source, whatever kind of heat pump it is. But there's massive economic potential there as well. When we were doing the work to prepare that bill, we were speaking to companies who wanted to set up shop in Scotland to manufacture these heat pumps. The moment that bill was dropped, all those investment opportunities were taken away. And in fact, the one factory that did make them has since closed. So we have lost job opportunities from that as well. It is now going to be incredibly challenging to decarbonise our heat network, but we have no other option. We cannot pretend that there's an alternative to decarbonisation when the climate crisis is becoming this profound. I think for those of us in the climate movement, which everybody in this room, we need to make sure that when we're talking to the public about this, we combine climate and cost of living. This is about how we reduce people's bills, not just tackle the climate emergency. We need to recognise that to win, we need to do both, or we need to communicate both.
Thank you. Colin.
Thank you, Lynn. I would ask the question, I think many people would ask of this question to me, can all our energy be provided by renewables by 2025? My question would be, can it be done? It's a legitimate question. Two things that are in my mind. One is base load, because there's the issue of renewables are not always constantly available. And secondly, I was fascinated, Lynn, by a debate. I suspect not many people watched it. I was surprised that I even watched it, but it was about Davos and the financiers. And they had one of the leading scientists in the world saying, it's not possible to make steel, aluminium or cement using renewable sources because the heat can't be generated to the degrees that you need to make steel. I say that as somebody who comes from Motherwell, because steel making was part and parcel of what we did. So I'd be wanting to know reassurances about whether this can be done or not, because quite frankly, what we don't need are promises to do something that the science and that we can't achieve. That gets us nowhere. And I say that, Lynn, because I'm old enough, I look around the room and with respect to everybody, there's people in the room who would remember the 1970s coming home from school when there was no electricity for 6 hours, the power cuts. And I remember, as I grew up and matured politically, some people claim that it has happened. I grew up and I realised that the left, the socialists, if I was the energy minister, it would be the end of my career if there was power cuts. Because the population's attitude would be, it smacks of inefficiency, ineffectiveness, and a lack of a plan. So what I want, and I'm committed to as a socialist, I won't tolerate the idea of power cuts. It's the failure of a system, catastrophic failure of a system. So to give an assurance about whether we can go to renewables completely by 2045, certain answers have to be given. And I have to say, my feeling is that certain scientific challenges have to be achieved by humankind.
Thank you. Okay, great.
So this brings me to mind of another Hustings I was on just a week ago, and it's around Energy Action Scotland, and their focus was obviously on people who are affected at the sharp end of the cost of living crisis in terms of energy, and it touches on, you know, moving to renewables is one thing. This again similar with independence, you can unlock a lot of this. You know, our grid is still linked to gas, the cost of electricity. It doesn't matter how much renewables you pay, it's the cost of gas at the moment that actually sort of tax the price. So it's just totally illogical. In the same way that the grid is set up in the UK, so that the further away you are from the population centres, in this case basically everywhere around Scotland, you actually pay much more to connect to the grid if you're generating energy. Despite the fact that if you were to inverse that map, that would give you the places that are most beneficial for siting a wind farm, because our weather is absolutely dreadful. So to answer your question though, because I realised I was sort of meandering off there, yes, we support decarbonisation by 2045. I think with interim targets 2030 for 50%, and I think we're on target last time I checked to get there. It's definitely doable, right? The base load can be solved by sort of tidal, and you know, even if you miss the target, not having the target means you will not have the energy to even get close to making the target, is what I believe. And fundamentally, the decisions that have been made recently, again around the Mingyang factory, things like this are hugely important. It's a £1.5 billion investment in the manufacturing chain of wind turbines. Right, that is not good for meeting that target. Not good at all. We need to have control over these levers here politically, the people who live and work in Scotland, to ensure we can meet that target.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Can I just say I'll send Colin something to convince him?
Yes, I believe you've written a briefing about 100% renewables as possible.
Several, yes.
I'm not sure whether it wasn't necessarily completely implied in the question, but I note that apart from the huge challenge which Ross has referred to, particularly about getting heating provided by electricity, that one other huge area which hasn't been mentioned is aviation, and we have to make aviation pay its true costs. I'm afraid, folks, we have to reduce the demand for aviation as well.
Okay, thank you for that. The next question I think is going to be asked by Lucy. And Lucy,
I represent the UN Scotland, and my question is about the values that we have there. And so I'm concerned about the implementation of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly number 1 on no poverty, number 3 on good health and well-being, and number 11 on sustainable cities and communities. So I was wondering, will your party support the implementation of these Sustainable Development Goals in Scotland?
Well, thank you, Lucy, for the question. This is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine, so I'll try and keep to 2 minutes, and apologies, this answer might end up getting quite technical and boring quickly, because the way we were supposed to implement the Sustainable Development Goals in Scotland was through our National Performance Framework, which was this dashboard of measures that we were supposed to use so that we focus on the outputs of public spending, the outputs of the decisions that Parliament and Government make, rather than the inputs. So, take one example, like, should we be focusing on 1,000 more doctors, or should we be focusing on increasing survival rates from cancer? That's the outcome you focus on. 1,000 more doctors might not be the way to do it. You might need something else. So that was the idea. I was on the committee in Parliament that did the inquiry that reviewed how the National Performance Framework was going. And in short, we realised nobody was using it. It was not being used. It had been launched with all this fanfare. This is how Scotland would meet the Sustainable Development Goals, and then it just wasn't being used. And what we've ended up with is huge amounts of policy incoherence across government. The worst example of that is, I remember, not in this session of Parliament, but in the last one, when Saudi Arabia was bombing Yemen into rubble, the Scottish Government, quite rightly, gave £500,000 to the crisis appeal for Yemen. But they'd given 5 times that to Raytheon, the company that manufactures the missiles that were being used to bomb Yemen into rubble. So total incoherence that we were funding the company responsible for this carnage, and then we were putting money into the emergency appeal for it. So we need to, both government and parliament, have a complete refresh on the national performance framework. And I'm excited to hear Sarah's answer to this, because Sarah's, I know, done a lot of work in this area. We actually need there to be consequences when government cannot justify the decisions it's made based on the national performance framework and therefore the sustainable development goals. Because it's easy to launch something like that and say, here's the framework we're going to use. But we did the review and found not only was government not using it, but Parliament wasn't using it either. The committees weren't using it to scrutinise the government, so everybody had forgotten. Sorry, hobby horse.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for your question. I have to say, the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, the United Nations isn't the organisation it used to be, is it? I'm a great fan of Tony Benn. I suspect other people in this panel are admirers of Tony Benn, who had great ideals about the United Nations and what it would be. He's probably of that generation where they put it in a high hopes for it after the Second World War. And I have to say, it hasn't lived up to them, nowhere near it. So much so that I think what the United Nations says, the big five powers could give a damn. They ignore it on virtually everything. It's heartbreaking. The idea that the United Nations is the assembly of the world's peoples is a good one, but it doesn't come near reality, does it? You've got the five powers who just treat it with contempt, every decision with contempt, whether it's on Gaza, whether it's on world poverty, whether it's on the climate, whether it's on anything else. And I hear the UN Secretary General, he seems to me a Spanish guy, isn't he? I forget his name offhand, but he's on the television regularly pleading with the world to try and take what's happening seriously, and he's a bleating voice. And I have to say, my feeling is it's all very well and good, these plans that they have, but unless they make some reality on the ground, they're meaningless. And I have to say, I'm reminded, I used this quote a lot when I was in the Parliament, of the Greek philosopher Anaxagoras, who talked about laws were like cobwebs, strong enough to hold the weak, but not strong enough to hold the strong. And I fear the United Nations, what it says, is falling into that trap. And that's a regrettable conclusion. And it's what makes me a socialist.
Okay, thank you.
So, do you mind, sorry Lucy, I missed the numbers because you went quite quick. What were the numbers you mentioned?
So number 1 on no poverty,
yep.
Number 3 on good health and well-being, and number 11 on sustainable communities and cities.
Fantastic. So I think there's, I'm not 100% sure about the working of the framework in the Parliament. I'd have to sort of give way to my colleagues either side here in terms of how it works. But we have embedded that into our plan going forward and how we do it. And I would say in terms of meeting some of those goals, no poverty particularly, that is the mission of John Swinney, is the mission of our party. In terms of that, child poverty is only falling in Scotland when you compare the other UK nations, and that is largely down to the Scottish child payment alongside other interventions we have made, and that is required difficult decisions like progressive taxation, which I will tell you from doesn't always go down well with voters, but we've taken that on and made that point to make the case to folk about the difference it makes to our communities and why it's the right thing to do. In terms of, I realise we're running out of time, so I'm going to have to rush very quickly. Good health and wellbeing, GP walk-in centres, we're opening them. They're particularly good at sustainable cities and communities. We have done quite a bit of investment there in terms of active travel, which I think is quite good, and also ties into the health one too to some extent, and probably poverty. I mean, those Voi bikes you see in Glasgow are very, very fast. And I'm getting good use from my friends, are getting good use at taking them around the city, and they're quite cheap and healthy. And once you electrify your grid and everything as well, renewables gives you the kind of base for that as well, which is very positive. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. Sarah.
Right. Well, as Ross said, I am passionate about this because actually joined up thinking and delivery is utterly essential if we're going to deliver fairness, if we're going to tackle poverty. We've got 3,000 kids in Edinburgh are currently in temporary accommodation. So we need to tackle the housing emergency. That's one of the issues about sustainable development goals. You talked about 11 sustainable communities. Absolutely critical that you've got homes that people can afford to live in. That's not happening at the moment. We urgently need to build more affordable homes. And thinking about how you build things together, health and well-being, we need to keep people well, not seeing them end up in A&E waiting for hours to get treatment. So there's something about healthier lifestyles. And I promoted a bill called the Wellbeing and Sustainable Development Bill. I had cross-party support, enthusiasm at the start. Then the Scottish Government was bringing in its bill. It was a Future Generations Commissioner like we have in Wales, which has worked. They're on their second commissioner. It brings public sector organisations together, they're held to account, to actually ask tough questions. Because the National Performance Framework that's been mentioned does not deliver. You're still seeing silo decisions. And I was totally disappointed when people were all very nice. Oh, this is nice, Sarah, thank you for bringing this to Parliament. But no, we're not going to back it. And I'm really disappointed. For me, it's kind of unfinished business. I'm going to keep campaigning on it. Because if you join up your thinking, affordable housing, you talked about benefits. So yeah, getting rid of the 2-child cap. Also getting people opportunities to have jobs, proper childcare. All these things have to join up, and it's hard for some people to think through what are all the 17 SDGs. But when you start grouping them together, you can see how you can transform people's lives, eliminate poverty, eliminate injustice, and create a country that will be fair and will actually work for everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
No, that was all positive. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. So I'm going to call on Bill Ramsey to ask the next question, please.
Okay, thank you. This is on behalf of the Scottish Trade Union Peace Network. It's basically 2 documents. One sponsored by the RMT called the Alternative Defence Review that talks about a more effective way of spending our monies to achieve the same purpose, and less monies for that matter. And the second document, the Royal United Services Institute, which is Britain's oldest military think tank. And the 50-word introduction to the Rusai paper actually sums it up quite well. Chancellor Merz talked about massive increases in defence spending throughout Europe. This is what Rusai had to say in August. The title of the paper is The False Promise of Defence as Prosperity. Framing defence spending as a path to prosperity ignores its poor economic return, limited job creation, and the opportunity cost of not making alternative public investments. That's from the Royal United Services Institute, set up by the Duke of Wellington in 1834. And the question is, do you agree with the Rusai and the RMT, 2 unusual bedfellows, in the assessment of defence, Keynesian defence economics as a wealth generator for the whole of society?
Right, I think it's with you, Colin.
Yeah, thank you very much for your question, Bill. Do you know, listen to the question and the references you made there. I've never been so glad in all my life that I left the Labour Party. I mean, I look at the last 2 years, and Keir Starmer, the warmonger in Ukraine, the warmonger in Gaza, the warmonger as far as defence spending is concerned, celebrating the fact that Scotland's shipyards, which only produce, it seems to me, warships, is something to be proud of. I don't remember the founders of the Labour Party having a goal in life to obliterate the rest of the world and celebrate the fact that they're spending more and more money on guns. And you know what strikes me sitting here, this is what, March 2026. A year ago, Keir Starmer was fawning over Donald Trump, wasn't he? Fawning over him, couldn't get enough of him. Come to Windsor, come to meet the Prince, come to meet the King. And here, he's obviously his political advisors, maybe Sarah said a line in it, told him that was a bad idea, Keir, it's doing your popularity no good whatsoever. And he's changed it, hasn't he? He's distanced himself from Trump to try and get popularity. But that's the wrong way. I have to say, I think that the RMT and the other studies that you mentioned highlight a world that's going in the wrong direction. Instead of spending money on housing, that Sarah mentions, on combating poverty that Lucy mentions, we're supposed to put on a pedestal the idea we spend more on missiles and gunships, whether they're built on the Ferry Road or they're built in Glasgow. And I remember the words of Hamish Henderson, the freedom come all ye, the black kids in yon Nyanga, terrified at the sight of the tartan and the skirl of the bagpipes because it was associated with oppression. That's not the message we want to send the people around the world that Scotland represents.
Yes, Bill, I enjoyed your sort of guiding us through there and tying those together. That was quite funny. I think, I would agree. You're talking £3 billion, 6% of the defence budget goes on Trident. In terms of its capital costs and its upkeep. Now we are not a party that believes you can go without any armed forces or anything like that. What we'd like to see is some of this invested in conventional forces and sort of ships to keep your waters safe and be able to ensure your territorial integrity as well around this. But you can see a lot of this through the way the current procurement goes for military vehicles in the UK. I think there was an infantry fighting vehicle that was created that made the soldiers sick and now cannot be used. So I think as much as possible, we aim towards Bairns, not bombs in this front. No nuclear weapons, and what you need to have a force that can do, peacekeeping, be a good global citizen, and keep your country safe. And that's where the SNP stands on it. That's where we've always stood on it as well. So you can take that one to the bank.
Sarah.
So I'm going to say I do think we need defence, but it's got to be proportionate and it's got to be targeted. It needs to be a clear strategy. Because if you think about Ukraine, we can't dismiss what's happened in Ukraine. We've got people that are living in Edinburgh who've had to flee from Ukraine, mostly women and children, but I've met lots of them. And it's still being attacked. It's still having its energy infrastructure wiped out. It's still having people killed on trains. War is not good. We need to actually be strong and stand beside the Ukrainians and not let Putin think he can just march all over another country. And then you've got what's happening in Iran. And the global rules were not met by the US and by Israel. And you're now seeing massive impacts on the world's economy. And, again, people are not surviving. And then you look at what's happening in Gaza. And we had a cross-party meeting with a doctor who works in Gaza. We need to be articulating the need for humanitarian support in places like Gaza and Sudan to end wars. So it's not just about building up infrastructure. In the Scottish Parliament, I think we should be thinking about what we can do that is actually about supporting people who come to our country who are fleeing from war zones. In the olden days it was Afghanistan, now it's Ukraine. Potentially people coming from Gaza to get health support of their children. We need to think about what we can do. And I would say what we also need to be doing is building infrastructure in Scotland. Buses, Calmac ferries, our railways. I talk to folk in the RMT and they want us to be investing in our railways, decarbonising, using modern infrastructure. There's so much more the Scottish Parliament can do as well.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you.
Yeah. Certainly not the first time I've agreed with the RMT. I'm a member of their parliamentary support group. Probably the first time that I've agreed with anything that RUSI have ever come out with is often a leading imperialist think tank. But they're quite right on this. And what's frustrating me about it is that I do not object to us giving support to Ukraine to defend itself from a fascist invasion. What I object to is that being used, the fact that Ukrainians are having to fight for their lives and their existence, that being used as an excuse by the UK and other imperialist powers to enter into another arms race. If Putin couldn't take Kyiv, he's not about to take Edinburgh or London. So using that as the excuse that Russia is some massive territorial existential threat to the UK is just so spectacularly misleading. And what it means is we're not investing in the things that would actually make us safer, primarily tackling the climate emergency, but also repurposing the British Armed Forces. Now, I don't want Scotland to be in Britain for any longer than it has to be, but while we're there, the British Armed Forces need to be repurposed to be able to respond to what is now going to be an era of climate catastrophe. They need to be able to be prepared and respond to that, but instead we're going to double down on nuclear weapons. We're going to double down on so-called conventional arms for a non-existent territorial threat from Russia. And none of this provides the kind of social good that can possibly justify that massive level of investment. There always seems to be more money for bombs and guns, and there's never enough money to wipe out poverty in this country. It would take a fraction of what gets spent on the global arms race to wipe out poverty and inequality, and yet we just keep doing it. So the question is why? Well, the fact that these arms dealers basically have a revolving door in their own passes to UK government departments, not just the Ministry of Defence, but the Department of Business and Trade, etc. As well. They can go in and get whatever they want. They can dictate terms. It's a two-way street. Former politicians, former ministers, etc. that end up on the boards of these arms dealers. But we do need to think about what we can do at Scottish level as well. And I'm really frustrated that a Green motion in Parliament to make Scotland the first country in the world to support the BDS campaign against Israel was passed. Every Scottish Government minister, every SNP, MSP voted for it with us, and not a single thing has been done since last September to actually implement that decision. So the Scottish Government...
Okay, so I'm sure most people will know BDS, boycott, divest, sanction, but just in case. Okay, right, so we're now, did you want to say anything back?
No, only the point that it's interesting that the IDF, the Israeli Defence Forces, is treated as almost a protected characteristic by the UK media.
Indeed. Can I make a comment about the cost of the UK's nuclear weapon system just very quickly, because there was news on that front today. Between 2024 and 2025 it cost £10.9 billion in that year alone. Today it's announced that that cost is probably going to increase by 20 to 25%, in large part, not entirely, to service the production of nuclear submarines for Australia as part of the AUKUS deal, right? So, even just that 20% increase could do an absolute number on poverty in the UK, certainly in Scotland, and probably in the UK as a whole. I just want to do that.
Right, so moving on to a question from Melanie Scott.
I'm representing Edinburgh Campaign Against Arms Trade. It wasn't just said something that I would have said, but in terms of Scotland, the legacy of the last government, or this current government, unfortunately includes handing millions in public money to companies linked to human rights abuses like Raytheon, Leonardo, BAE Systems, Kerr. This is not just an abstract issue. These funds have been actively diverted from supporting Scottish businesses that could help us build a just, sustainable future and deliver social good. They're being given to extremely rich companies that don't need our money. So what would you do to make sure Scottish public money is not being used to support the manufacture or development of weapons, technology and components used to commit war crimes? Thank you.
Okay, yep. So in terms of the what's been mentioned around the BDS strategy, that's something we've voted to implement. We're in support of that. That it can be quite complicated. I think the SNP have voted in Edinburgh Council as well to change the position of the pension fund there to be a pro BDS one as well. That's our position. We've always been firm in terms of calling it what it is, a genocide in Gaza. And I think anything we can do to try and stop public money going to these places is something that we're committed to, and something you'll see us do in the next term as well. I think crucially, using that platform as well, which is what to make sure that pressure is applied to the UK government to uphold its obligation as a good citizen as well. You've seen this previously where it nearly ripped the Labour Party in two after I think they get bailed out by the Speaker, Lindsay Hoyle at that point, when they would not call it a genocide. I'm not even certain that their position currently is. I don't think that is the Labour Party's position. It's the Labour Speaker's position here, but it's not the position of Keir Starmer. And it's not the position of any of the senior members of that party either. We've also been raising the alarm bell about Palantir, which for those of you that don't know is a really dodgy company that is sort of coiling itself around. It's been handed out contracts, and I'd be interested to hear what the answer to this is. Why have they been handed contracts despite how very clearly wrong-ins they are, frankly, for our defence contract to the NHS and around several, I think they recently got access to the tax base, I think, or something like that in finances. Very, very dangerous. And I'd be very keen to know what the answer to that is, because they are up to their eyes in what's going on in the occupied territories in Gaza as well. So,
thank you. Yeah, well, I am not able to answer every question that you have just posed me, Alex, because I've been in the Scottish Parliament and my focus has actually been about how the Scottish Government spends its money, and there's more we can do in terms of fair trade, there's more we can do in terms of procurement, where does money come from, transparency, how do we spend that money. For example, I would allow all local authorities to procure energy from Scottish community energy companies. They're not allowed to do that, apparently. That's something I've been lobbying on for some time. And I think making people more aware of where we buy our food from. People don't really think about that, but fair trade. I've met people from Malawi, from Gaza, whose lives are transformed because they're able to export to us. But if you look at what's happening in Gaza now, it's a humanitarian crisis. And it's also a humanitarian crisis in the Lebanon. So for me, my current focus is about making people aware of what is happening, what we can do, both as individuals, as councils, and the Scottish Government, to actually change how we spend our money and we get value for it that will actually help people.
Thank you. Thank you. Ross.
I want to start off by actually just saying a huge thank you and well done to Campaign Against the Arms Trade and a lot of the other folk and organisations in the room, because in February of last year the Green MSPs brought a motion to Parliament saying that we should not be spending a penny of public money on Israel's arms dealers, and every other party opposed it. By September, because of the work of people in this room and across the country, the SNP felt enough pressure that they changed their position, so they supported the motion the Greens brought in September. Again, nobody else did, but at that point, Green plus SNP meant a majority, so Scotland became the first country in the world to have its Parliament pass a BDS motion. That was because of our collective movement. Now, as I made the point a moment ago, the National have investigated this. Scottish Government ministers have not even commissioned advice from civil servants on how to implement that BDS motion, despite the fact it was in September. So very frustrating. But the question was, well, what do we do now? So obviously, the Greens have campaigned alongside CAP for a long time to stop any public money being going to these arms dealers. But there's a wider suite of measures that we can take there. So, for example, one thing the Scottish Government can do to allow councils to take part in the global peace movement and the BDS movement specifically is repeal a single line of the Local Government Act from 1990, because that bans councils from making procurement decisions based on geography. Thatcher brought that in to stop people from boycotting apartheid South Africa, and it's still on the statute books, and it makes it basically impossible for councils to take part in the boycott of Israel. So we can repeal that line. We should be banning not just the arms dealers, but all 120-ish companies on the UN's list of those complicit in the West Bank settlements. Every one of them should be banned from getting public money. The arms dealers most obviously, but other companies like Airbnb, etc., who are on that list should be banned as well. And Bill mentioned about the IDF having served in the IDF almost being a protected characteristic in the UK. Well, in 2001, we put the International Criminal Court statutes into Scots law, which makes a war crime committed anywhere in the world by a resident of Scotland a crime here in Scotland. We should prosecute IDF soldiers who live here because there are dozens of them.
can I just say to Melanie, I'm always struck in the nature of this debate between how, if you'll pardon the pun, those of us in favour of peace are outgunned by the forces in favour of killing. And I think about Kat and the work you do, and I think about who we're fighting against, if you allow us to make the royal we here. Not just fighting Raytheon and British Aerospace and Leonardo's, because these are multinational corporations, extremely profitable, extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, and they have influence in governments. They have influence in the Scottish government, I'm sorry to say, that they shouldn't have. They've got influence in the Labour government that it should be ashamed of, and it shouldn't have. And I'm reminded, probably don't need to remind this audience, so hope you'll forgive me, Britain, the 5th biggest arms manufacturer in the world. The 5th biggest arms manufacturer in the world. Take that to the World Cup. When we're all celebrating the countries of Britain who are in the World Cup, hopefully there's 4 of them, but at least 3 of them, and the rest of the world thinking, oh aye, that's the country with the 5th biggest arms manufacturing base in the world. It's shocking. It's not what the people of this country want. And the second part of the question, Lynn, is about BDS, and as much as I've written to Keir Starmer and John Swinney repeatedly to say, you've not done anywhere near enough to help the Palestinian people. Not anywhere near enough to help the Palestinian people take for granted that which every other nation in the world is entitled to. The right to healthcare, education, a citizenship of their own, and peace for the future. And they've not done anywhere near enough. And we therefore need to keep the pressure on, during this election too, on the SNP, on the leadership, as well as the British leadership, because it goes hand in hand, the same obligation. That's the wishes of the Scottish people in this election. They've made it repeatedly clear, and we want to see more action than we've seen hitherto.
Yes.
Just briefly reply.
Yes, please.
Okay, well, keep it brief. We and many other groups have done endless freedom of information requests about what is happening with this stopping funding these arms companies by Scottish Enterprise, the business arm of the Scottish Government, but we have got no responses that indicate any action. So, we would ask you what you are going to do, and to think carefully about what you're going to do to stand with communities around the world affected by war and oppression, commit to end. Why are we giving this money to very rich arms companies to kill people?
Thank you, Melanie. For the next question, I'm going to call in Janet Fenton.
Hello. I think I'm speaking for Secure Scotland. Our remit is really to challenge some of the language and actually to look at how Scotland could serve peace and justice better. So, I mean, I'm on the same platform as just about everybody else that's asking these questions. They're all things that concern us. And we're trying to get rid of language like defence spending and other such absurd expressions. And so my question is actually, if elected, will you recognise the role of the Scottish Government in that it should comply with the UN human rights legislation domestically, but also where its impact relates to international matters, including treaties and international humanitarian law?
Well, I think one of the privileges I've had in the Parliament is being the chair of the cross-party group on international development, and what we've been doing is scrutinising how the Scottish Government supports international development and getting feedback from all the different third sector organisations, both in Scotland and globally, about what more we could do. And it's partly about human rights, but a lot of it is about investment and about supporting people. So we've talked about the climate emergency and what we could do in Scotland, but actually a lot of those countries are currently experiencing the climate emergency. They're not able to produce food, they don't have clean water that people can rely on, they're not using renewables, and there's so much more I think we could do in terms of passing on information and investment that would actually support communities. We had projects that gave us feedback where the impact on sustainable agriculture meant that they were able to produce food locally, women in particular were able to sell food, they were able to send their kids to school, and there's something about the wider impact of the positive stuff that we could do. And there's lobbying also doing what we could do in Scotland with our international development money. And I've been very supportive. I'm always critical of the SNP government, but I've been supportive of the principle because I think that's something we should be spending money on and making an impact and then generating extra investment. So there's so much more we could do because the number of people at risk of the climate emergency is going to actually make a lot of the stuff we've just talked about even tougher. And we've got to act on it now. It's not a nice to have. It's our global responsibility as a country that when we had trouble, we were quite happy for people to go abroad and make money. We've now got a responsibility to pay that back and to support communities right across the world, but particularly the low-income ones.
Thank you. Ross.
If Janet doesn't mind, I'm going to start answering this question by talking about Janet. So I said a minute ago that it was myself and Bill Kidd who run the Parliament's cross-party group on nuclear disarmament. We're just the pretty faces of the operation. Janet Fenton has been the driving force of making sure that the Parliament has a cross-party group on nuclear disarmament. Make sure that was recognised. On the specifics of the question, so there will be a lot in the Green Manifesto about making sure that, as we've touched on earlier on, that there's coherence. If the Scottish Government is, as it refers to itself, a rights-respecting government, that needs to apply across the board. So I mentioned a minute ago, in 2001, we put the International Criminal Court statutes into Scots law, but there's never been a prosecution under them, despite the fact we know there have been dozens of people who've served from Scotland, who've served in the Israeli Defence Forces in a force of occupation, who have undoubtedly participated in a genocide and other war crimes and who've returned here and not been prosecuted. And that's just the Israeli occupation forces. Undoubtedly there will have been people who have been complicit in war crimes elsewhere in the world. And that is on the Scottish Government and our prosecution service. Real questions need to be asked, pressure needs to be brought to bear there. We also need to end the absolute joke that is Scottish enterprise system of human rights checks. They're not actually human rights checks, they're reputational risk management checks. If Raytheon can pass your human rights checks, they're not worth the paper that they're written on. So those checks were only introduced in 2019 because Cat and the Greens have put so much pressure on the government to embarrass them. But the checks they introduced were worthless, so we would scrap those and replace them with decent ones. We would go further than just the arms dealers. I mentioned before, the United Nations has a list of companies complicit in Israel's West Bank settlements. Why aren't you eligible to get Scottish Government grants, to get public contracts here in this country? That is absolutely outrageous. And we need the government to actually, in its international trade policy, start taking human rights seriously. The Scottish Government has seen China, for example, as just an investment bonanza. China's had 2 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps. I'll finish there, but ethical investment policy, absolutely essential, currently non-existent.
What I'd say to Janet, first of all, I'm sure you know, and we're not the only ones in this room that have been struck by the Orwellian use of the word defence when it means attack. And the way the British government in particular talks about exporting democracy, human rights and civilisation to the world when it's doing exactly the opposite. But Janet's question was, if elected, will you do X? And I thought this is probably the point where I should say, I'm standing for the Scottish Socialist Party on the list in Edinburgh in the Lothians East area. I know Sarah mentioned it earlier on. I thought I should have mentioned that in case somebody had forgotten it, so you get the chance to vote for me. But I tell you what strikes me centrally about the question Janet's asking. I was speaking at an independence conference with Jim Sillars a week past on Saturday, and he pointed out the price that we in Scotland have paid for the very restricted 1999 settlement of a Scottish Parliament that doesn't get to discuss macroeconomic policy, human rights internationally, world affairs, etc. We've paid a price for 27 years of being stilted. We've not been able to discuss it in the Parliament, not discuss it thoroughly enough with government, and the country has not been afforded the opportunity to extend our interest in these parts of the world, extend our engagement in these parts of the world, and it needs to be rectified. And that's why I, Scottish Socialist Party, there are others, we want, and Ross's party, we want independence. We want all the rights to discuss what we deem to be necessary, what we deem to be important, and what we deem to be Scotland's place in the world internationally. And that's why we support independence.
I realise as well, I'm standing on the South of Scotland list, I'm self-list, and standing in the constituency of Hamilton, Larkhall and Stonehouse constituency for the SNP. I've probably used this term a couple of times today, but I think our commitment is using the privilege and the position of the Scottish Government to be a good global citizen and to always advocate for the international rules-based order, and in terms of aiding countries that that need help, particularly through climate change, I think is a big one as well. Now, I was at the campaign launch for our party this morning, and that was one of the questions that our party leader was asked, and he reiterated the importance around that the international law and the United Nations and respecting these regulations as you've spoken about there. Because the world, if they become totally meaningless, the world in which we live at that point is not a pretty one for future generations, and that's just not acceptable. There's a lot of undermining of this that's happened. You've seen it with Trump, just sort of effectively assassinating heads of state. Very, very dangerous track. There is, and everything we do should be pushing back on that de-escalation. And again, I mentioned this at the interjection of Scotland Hustings. The escalation you're seeing in Iran will hit people's food bills, and it will increase the cost of living too. But again, we have our party leader recommitted to the importance of aid overseas at a time when that is not a popular position through our Malawi project. Just last week, I think there was about £6 billion cut from the overseas aid budget by Labour, by Yvette Cooper, to fund military spending.
Right, thank you.
The UK government down south is not what it used to be, folks. If any of you have memories of Labour 20 years ago, it ain't the same party.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sarah.
Yeah, I think we do need to keep the humanitarian support that we've done. I mentioned the fact I've been involved in the cross-party group in international development. I'd also read the Yvette Cooper speech, and she talked about Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, and now the Lebanon as well, because what Israel is doing in the Lebanon is creating a humanitarian crisis. So we have to actually stand up and support those countries. And I also saw an article in the BBC this week that said, are we about to move to World War III? And I just think we have got to do everything we can to de-escalate conflicts, to support humanitarian rights in countries, and those countries, Ukraine, Sudan, Gaza, Lebanon, what's happening in the West Bank at the moment, that is unacceptable. It's breaking human rights. And there was a comment about BBC earlier. BBC aren't allowed into Gaza. So you see BBC reporters from the Israeli capital, but they're not allowed into Gaza. So there's something about transparency and accountability, and those countries need to be held to account. And I agreed with the phrase about being a good global citizen, and I think that is what Starmer is trying to do in Iran, because we are not in a good place there, and he is not sending military to support the US and Israel, but what he is trying to do is to de-escalate. And the points that were made there by Alex about it's going to impact on our food, it's going to impact massively in the global economy, and there are countries, there are people that are going to starve. So we need to get these wars ended, because it is not good for people. It's not good for human rights, but it's not good for poverty. And it's, we had a good meeting about Eritrea in the Parliament before Christmas. When I say Eritrea, Tigray, there's a conflict in Tigray. Most of us don't know about that, but there are conflicts happening all around the world, and we have a global responsibility to take an interest and do what we can to act.
Thank you. Thank you. Did you want to come back?
I just want to say that I think we do have the aspiration, and I mean that's really why I'm here tonight. This is the election that matters to me, for the Parliament that matters to me, for the government that matters to me, because I'm not represented at that government down the road. And I can't actually, through the electoral system, have any impact on making any change there whatsoever. But it's more than an aspiration. All these things that we said when we got devolution, there is statement after statement, government policy after government policy about our position as a Scottish country, that with the sovereign rights of the people, with the 4 words on the maize, thank you, Sarah. You know, these all matter to people. And if you guys are going to be worth your salt, you've got to be able to do this stuff.
Thank you very much, Joanna. One more question. So let's give them a big round of applause.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Hope you enjoyed that. Don't forget to subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're listening on YouTube, you can click the little bell and you get a reminder whenever we put out a new episode, which is every Friday.
And sign up for our mailing list. You can do that from the website. And we always send one out at the beginning of each month to tell you what's happening. Last but not least, you can buy us a coffee on coffee.com.
And we'll catch you later. Bye now.